We are seeing here a young Ukrainian boy dragging himself towards an uncertain future in Poland, maybe without his mom and dad. That's what it is becoming, cold and cruel. Listen to it closely and try to feel the despair and anguish that bring forth in times like these. From the outside, it is a glamorous war about guns and bombs and people dying heroic death. Inside is this shivering and merciless confusion and hopelessness. In another scene, on March 4th, 2022, 9 days into the shocking military operation, Russia captured one of Ukraine's nuclear power plant, which is the largest nuclear plant in Europe. Nighttime video footage from the plant showed the scenes of horror, fire, shelling, and an explosion around the nuclear plant. Everybody understandably scared that things could take a turn wherein we see a situation worse, 10 times worse, than the horrendous accident we saw in Chernobyl on 26 April 1986. How did it come to this? Why are we seeing such stories of tragedies and terrible dangers once again? Nuclear annihilation looming with distinct possibility, and maybe a world war. I think it was just a few months, if not days back, when it was coronavirus that we were tackling haphazardly and somehow reaching a normalcy. How did we manage to reach from a natural catastrophe to this confusion and horror? Let us rewind back slightly, that is, a few decades back in the early 90s, the lovely decade that had its share of controversies and events, which of course influenced many years to come. It was also a time that saw the rise of the internet and a time that brought an end to the decade-long Cold War when the mighty Soviet Union fell. Now, to understand the roots of this increasingly complicated Russia-Ukraine crisis today, we should start right here. Be prepared, it would be a little history lesson of sorts. I know I might miss out on a lot of detail here, but let's see a few important ones in my view. In any conflict of such a nature, the explanation is not always easy. The tragic events that we are seeing getting unfolded before our eyes were not something that only developed on the laps of these two countries. Just to give you an idea, we can add here the smaller factors such as political actors of surrounding nations, the clumsy intervention from the West, who themselves were fulfilling their own agendas for the sake of competition, etc., etc. But to make this video clear, we would see few key events and situations that caused the distrust between these nations, and also how the nuclear nations try to establish what is right and wrong for a country while completely forgetting the people who reside in them. Basically, a well-proven ingredient for a dreadful tragedy. Since 1991, Moscow has had a difficult and testy relations with Ukraine ever since the disintegration of USSR. Due to the loss of the coveted superpower status with a mixture of economic collapse and an ideological confusion, Russia was suffering through a deep identity crisis. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russian Federation, was humiliated for his excessive dependence on loans from the West and also by NATO's decision to expand the alliance to include former Warsaw Pact countries. A quick explanation. Warsaw Pact was a defense treaty established by the Soviet Union and 7 other Soviet satellite countries: Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, and Poland and Romania. But due to a strong desire from these countries and also because of the faltering situation of the Soviet Union, the pact ended in 1991. Now back to the main story. Ukraine was a litmus test of Russia's rebirth. The country was by far the largest state that had split away from Russia in 1991, and most importantly, it was strategically placed between Russia and West. For Russians, Ukrainians were like younger brothers with similar language and culture. They, however, have also been believing that Ukraine's Russian-speaking population were persuaded to adopt Ukrainian language, which never went well with them. Ukraine, on the other hand, strived to become a sovereign and independent country and never really had that great of a relation with Russia. They have been complaining that Russia never accepted them to be a sovereign nation. Just to give you an example of how the Moscow thinks of Ukraine, Putin, being Putin, reportedly told George Bush in 2008 that Ukraine is not even a country. Ukraine had a difficult time with the policies of Soviet era, which appeared to neglect the Ukrainian culture and well-being, An example would be cruel Stalin collectivization program, in which small land holdings of many peasants were brought into a collective large farm, which majorly caused the 1932 famine that killed more than 3 million Ukrainians. Finally, in 1994, it appeared that both the parties came to a sort of agreement under the Budapest Memorandum brokered by the US. Russia recognized Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, with a security assurance that Ukraine would be protected from the Russian attack. In return, Ukraine had to give up any claim to the former Soviet nuclear weapons, which were still located on Ukrainian territory. Then in 1997, Ukraine gave Russia a 20-year lease on the Sevastopol naval base in Crimea, which is based to the Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Now, leases can be positive for global peace and stability by letting countries meet territorial needs with transactions that involve drastic changes in the boundaries of the nation. For example, France still pays rent to Spain for an area called as Pays Quant, so that French shepherds can use the Spanish pastures exclusively. In this situation, however, lease being of such a short period never really solved the problem between Ukraine and Russia. The turning point came in 1999 when NATO forces bombed Yugoslavia to stop human rights violation in Kosovo. It justified the bombardment by saying that it was a humanitarian intervention in order to halt Yugoslav president's ethnic cleansing of non-Serbs. This event basically highlighted the geopolitical sidelining of Russia. It failed to protect Serbia, which was its traditional ally. Now we have to keep adding the events that we talked about before, and especially of Kosovo in the following incidents, to form a larger view of the whole Ukrainian affair today.
Клянусь, при осуществлении полномочий президента Российской Федерации.
In the year 2000, Vladimir Putin came into power. On the establishing foundation of a growing economy, Putin was forming a new Russian identity. The image that was getting built was that of a great powerful nation that can stand tall against USA. Russians accepted this idea of their nation being a superpower, an idea that had its roots in Soviet Russia and its history. All was going somewhat steady between Russia and Ukraine, as both of them were trying their hardest to maintain a balance in the fragile relationship between them. But the relationship got threatened in the early 2000s due to the wave of color revolution, in which authoritarian leaders were toppled over by the popular protests for democratic rights. Vladimir Putin saw something was devious here and imagined the whole revolution to be nothing but an orchestrated campaign by the West to spread democracy in the post-Soviet states. He took significant steps to prevent this wave reaching Moscow. He tightened the restrictions on the opposition while also made efforts to create a wave of popular opinion on his own regime. Putin slowly became convinced that Russia is subjected to a deliberate encirclement from the US. It was further cemented by the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the Western recognition of the independence of Kosovo from Serbia in February 2008. In the somewhat same time, in April 2008, tensions between Georgia and Russia began escalating. On 7th August 2008, Georgian president announced a ceasefire. But South Ossetian separatists, who were backed by the Russians, intensified their attacks on Georgian villages. Georgian troops, on the other hand, had to return the fire and advance towards the capital of the self-proclaimed Republic of South Ossetia during the night of 8th August. Russia then accused Georgia of aggression against South Ossetia and launched a large-scale invasion on Georgia under the pretext of peacekeeping operation on 8th August. Now, have you heard something similar before?
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Yes, the special military operation. Soviet Union has always been using the excuse of peacekeeping to hold its position in post-Soviet territories. It's always the same strategy: incite conflict in the countries in the former USSR, following up with that an intervention in the appearance of peacekeeping activity. This creates a favorable situation with the help of which they can have a permanent presence in former Soviet states and also sustain a considerable influence on their foreign and domestic politics. Historically, they have applied the same strategy in Moldova as well, just like we saw in the above example with Georgia. And somewhere its main objective has always been to establish and legitimize Russian military presence on the Ukrainian territory and also use these countries as the instruments to influence Ukraine. Did we not see the similar reasoning being applied by the NATO to attack Yugoslavia to stop the ethnic cleansing by its leadership? Should they ask themselves, are they both in fault? The fundamental reason behind this intervention by both the sides appears to be highly political, and in my view, I cannot see a great moral reason behind them. The sufferers of this maddening hunger for power and influence are us, the common people who cry when they have nothing to eat and who can die when they go out for a piece of bread. We have learned before that in Budapest Memorandum of 1990s, Russia had assured that there would be a security from the Russian attack in the future. But in 2014, this was shattered when Russia invaded Ukrainian territory and annexed Crimea, and further supported wholeheartedly the upheaval caused by the pro-Russian separatists in the Donbas region. Before this, Putin was already furious with the mass protests in Ukraine that had erupted due to the abandonment of a trade agreement with the European Union by the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych, a mass protest which, by the way, was visited by the US diplomats, agitating Putin further. He has also been increasingly anxious that Ukraine might join NATO and could cause a serious security concern for Russia. March and April of 2021, Putin ordered his military to amass thousands of men and equipment near the border with Ukraine and Crimea. This caused a widespread concern over the possible invasion of Ukraine. Satellite images showed movements of armor, missiles and heavy weaponry. The troops were slightly withdrawn in June, but once again built up the force around the region in October 2021. This time the numbers were higher and the concerns surrounding the situation too. By December 2021, Russian troops that were amassing near the Ukrainian border reached 100,000. With all this development around the border, Russia kept on denying that there was any plan of invasion. On 21st February, Russia officially recognized Donbas as independent states and deployed troops in Donbas. A day later, Putin stated that the Minsk agreement, which was a sort of peace agreement for the Donbas region, was no longer valid. On the morning of 24th February, as we all know, Putin announced a special military operation.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима.
And with that reasoning, launched a full-scale invasion into Ukraine. No one is sure where this will go now. Majority of cities in Ukraine are getting destroyed because of this madness. Russian forces, who must be surprised by the resistance shown by the Ukrainian people, the chances of their attack getting escalated is a surety. Millions of innocents more would get displaced. The plan from the Russian side is to break the strong will shown by the Ukrainians and slowly destroy every village standing against them. Recently, Vladimir Putin talked to Turkish president about his demands for a peace deal with Ukraine. First few demands, it seems, are not difficult to meet for them, like acceptance by Ukraine that it should be neutral and should not join NATO. Ukraine would have to undergo a disarmament process to ensure it wasn't a threat to Russia. Then there would have to be protection for the Russian language in Ukraine, and there is also an element called denazification that Putin wants Ukraine to follow. I'm pretty sure these points are not that difficult to achieve for Ukraine. However, the next demand is tougher to digest for them and could lead to further the conflict. They could demand Ukrainian government to give up territory in eastern part of Ukraine. The other one could be that Russia could demand Ukraine to formally accept Crimea as part of Russia. Because of the above difficult points, the peace deal could take a long time to find out. Ukraine has suffered immensely since the start of this invasion. The rebuilding of towns and cities and the rehousing of the millions that got displaced would take time as well. Not just this, the scarring of the young mind is a completely different challenge that could take even longer time to heal. This, God forbid, may be just start of the potential worst days ahead for not just Ukraine, but maybe Europe and the world at large. Putin on 18th March 2022 made a special appearance before the crowd to celebrate the annexation of Crimea, which they call as Crimean Spring. Highlighting every such act as a love for the motherland, Putin also praised military for their unity and hard work on the field. It is said that many people, not all, many people in the stadium were either forced to come or were not just aware that the event was held in support of the war in Ukraine. Here is what Putin stated in his speech about his main objective of this so-called special military operation.
Избавить людей от этих страданий, от этого геноцида является основной, главной причиной, побудительным мотивом и целью военной операции, которую мы начали на Донбассе и на Украине. Именно в этом цель.
He also stressed on the resolve for this invasion, saying that we know what we need to do next, how to do it and at what cost, and we will definitely carry out all the plans we have made. Recently, the Moskva, Russia's flagship in its Black Sea fleet, sank. Both the sides have a different story to tell on this. Russia says that the stormy weather caused it, whereas Ukrainians says that the ship sank because of their missile strike. As of making this video, this is yet to be confirmed what has exactly happened. Russia continues its bombardment of Ukrainian cities since the start of Ukrainian invasion, 60 plus days back. The Russian forces have pulled back from some parts of northern Ukraine after suffering losses and failing to capture Kiev. The whole situation is causing Finland and Sweden to consider joining NATO, whereas Russia has warned them that if both the countries join, Russia would deploy nuclear weapons and hypersonic missiles around Baltic Sea in the heart of Europe. Strangely, many knew this invasion was an ongoing process for Russia. If the other parties, US, Europe and other nations don't interfere strongly to this, the Ukraine invasion was a certainty. Of course, there were sanctions here and there before, not as immediate and as harsh as we are seeing today. But still, there were sanctions, which, by the way, few European politicians believed needed a phased lifting of sanctions against Russia. We know that there are countless other factors that come into play here. But it is us as well who are responsible for every evil that happened around us. Winston Churchill believed that World War II should have been called as an unnecessary war. He explained that there never was a war more easy to stop than that, and yet we suffered the bloodiest conflict in human history. During the 1930s of that period, the West had numerous chances to take critical actions to stop the maniacal advance of Adolf Hitler, but they did not. The poor leadership back then resulted in the war that took millions of lives. We could have learned from that, but do we really learn from that? It seems we are not equipped with such a faculty. B.H. Lindelhart, in his book Why Don't We Learn from History, highlights this. History teaches that there has been a long-running battle with fear of the truth. People mistakenly fail to admit the truth. In so doing, help to perpetuate recorded falsehoods. And if it's not fear, then it's distortion of the truth to promote a personal or political cause. We bend the reality during this time, that is, during war and tragedy, and tend to exaggerate the things that feed our delusions, and forget conveniently those things that make us uncomfortable, because they reveal our weakness, they highlight our mistakes. We are scared of the truth. We could have avoided all this if there were harsher steps taken in the many reasons that Russia had given in the past few decades of its history. We would probably have seen this child, who is dragging himself dejected towards a new land and future, live a normal life with his parents in his own land. If we could have faced our fears and accepted our truth, if we had learned from our past, this is the most basic thing that we all deserve. So guys, if you have watched the entirety of the video, thank you so much. You already know what I would be saying here, as this is mine and Pragya's first attempt at making a YouTube video. We would like to know how you like the effort, and if you have any feedback, please drop a comment. We want to improve and do a better video ahead, so your feedback would be really helpful. Also, if you could please subscribe to our channel, it would be a motivating factor for us to do better going ahead. Once again, thank you, and we will see you in our next video.